The coffee was lukewarm, the pie was stale, and the fluorescent lights buzzed like dying insects above the worn vinyl booths of Mel's Diner. It was exactly 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in Cedar Creek, Texas, population 1,847, where nothing ever happened and nobody ever looked twice at the quiet waitress refilling their cups. Sarah Mitchell had been serving coffee, and dreams deferred for 3 years now, her auburn hair pulled back in the same messy bun, her uniform bearing the same coffee stains, her smile the same practiced blend of politeness and indifference. She moved through the diner like a ghost, invisible to truckers, insomniacs, and the occasional lost traveler who stumbled into this forgotten corner of America. But tonight, someone was watching. Tonight, everything would change. Because hidden beneath the rolled-up sleeve of her uniform, barely visible in the dim light, was a tattoo that told a story the government had spent millions trying to erase. Marcus Webb had been driving for 18 hours straight, his eyes burning from the endless stretch of Interstate 35, when he spotted the neon sign of Mel's Diner cutting through the Texas darkness like a beacon. The retired CIA operative needed caffeine, needed to stretch his legs, needed anything to keep him awake for the final push to Austin. He slumped into a corner booth, the cracked leather squeaking under his weight, and barely glanced up when the waitress approached with her pot of coffee and tired smile. But as she reached across the table to fill his cup, her sleeve rode up just enough to reveal a flash of ink on her forearm. Marcus's blood went cold. His trained eyes locked onto the image, a serpent coiled around a dagger, its fangs bared, its scales rendered in precise detail. It wasn't just any tattoo. It was the mark of Operation Nightshade, a classified program so secret that only 12 people in the world were supposed to know it existed. The tattoo was small, no bigger than a silver dollar, but to Marcus it might as well have been a neon sign screaming classified information. Operation Nightshade had been a joint CIA Special Forces initiative designed to place deep-cover operatives in hostile territories across the Middle East and Eastern Europe. The serpent and dagger weren't just symbolic, they were a recognition code, a way for assets to identify each other in the field. Marcus had helped design the program himself back in 2019, and he knew with absolute certainty that every operative who carried that mark was supposed to be dead. The official records showed 12 casualties, 12 heroes who had given their lives for their country in a bombing in Damascus 3 years ago. 12 bodies recovered, 12 funerals with flag-draped coffins, 12 families who believed their loved ones had died serving America. But Sarah Mitchell was very much alive, pouring coffee in a Texas diner at 2:17 a.m., carrying a tattoo that proved she was one of the ghosts. Sarah had noticed the man's reaction the moment her sleeve slipped. She'd grown careless after 3 years of hiding, 3 years of believing she was safely buried in the anonymity of small-town Texas. But the way his eyes had widened, the way his hand had instinctively moved toward his jacket, told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't just another truck driver or insomniac. He was agency, probably retired, definitely dangerous. Her training kicked in like muscle memory, her body language shifting subtly as she continued her rounds, refilling coffee and taking orders while her mind raced through escape routes and contingency plans. She'd survived too much to die in a diner. The official story was that Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell had been killed along with 11 other operatives when their safe house in Damascus was hit by a suicide bomber. The reality was far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. The night Sarah Mitchell died, she was actually 30 miles away from Damascus, deep in the Syrian desert, completing what should have been a routine intelligence gathering mission. She and her team had infiltrated a weapons trafficking network that was supplying ISIS with American-made munitions stolen from Iraqi military bases. For 6 months, she'd posed as a Swedish humanitarian aid worker, documenting the trafficking routes and identifying key players in the network. But on March 15, 2022, everything went wrong. Her handler's communications suddenly went dark. Local contacts started disappearing, and then she received an encrypted message that changed everything. Package compromised. All assets burned. Extraction impossible. You are officially KIA as of 0400 hours. Do not attempt contact. This is your only warning. The Damascus bombing had been real. The 12 casualties had been real, but Sarah hadn't been there. Someone had used the tragedy to erase her from existence. Marcus watched Sarah work, noting the way she moved with unconscious precision, the way her eyes constantly scanned the room, the way she kept her back to the wall whenever possible. These weren't the habits of a small-town waitress. These were the survival instincts of someone who'd been trained to kill and trained to disappear. He'd seen enough operatives to recognize the signs, the controlled breathing, the way she held herself ready to move in any direction, the almost imperceptible bulge under her uniform that suggested she was still armed. But why was she here? Why had someone with her skills and training chosen to hide in plain sight in a nowhere diner in Texas? And more importantly, who had wanted her dead badly enough to fake her death and erase her from every official record? Marcus pulled out his phone and pretended to scroll through messages while actually accessing a secure database he technically no longer had authorization to use. The search results made Marcus's hands shake. According to the classified files he was illegally accessing, Operation Nightshade hadn't just been about intelligence gathering, it had been about something far more sinister. The 12 operatives hadn't been investigating weapons trafficking, they'd been investigating their own government. Someone high up in the CIA had been selling weapons to terrorist organizations, using the Syrian conflict as cover for a massive arms-dealing operation. The operatives had gotten too close to the truth, and their deaths in Damascus hadn't been a tragic accident, they'd been a deliberate elimination of witnesses. But Sarah had escaped the purge, had somehow survived and gone underground. For 3 years, she'd been living with the knowledge that her own government had tried to have her killed, and that somewhere in Washington, a traitor was still profiting from the chaos in the Middle East. Sarah could see the man's reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser as he worked his phone, his fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone accessing classified systems. She recognized the look of concentration, the slight forward lean that indicated he was reading something that surprised him. Whatever he'd found in those files, it was enough to make him reassess everything he thought he knew about her situation. She finished taking an order from a tired trucker and made her way to the coffee station, using the opportunity to position herself where she could see both the front door and the kitchen exit. Her mind was already calculating. It was a 4-hour drive to the Mexican border. She had $3,000 in cash hidden in her apartment, and her go-bag with false documents was always within reach. But running would mean starting over again, finding a new identity, a new life, a new way to disappear. She'd done it once, she could do it again, but she was tired of running from ghosts. The diner was nearly empty now, just Marcus, the trucker who was methodically working his way through a stack of pancakes, and an elderly couple sharing a piece of apple pie in comfortable silence. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal against the backdrop of the deadly game being played out in whispers and meaningful glances. Marcus closed his phone and made a decision that would either save Sarah's life or get them both killed. He stood up slowly, making sure his hands were visible, and walked to the counter where Sarah was wiping down the coffee machine with mechanical precision. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of 3 years of deception and betrayal. "Nightshade 7, he said, using Sarah's operational call sign. "We need to talk. Your handler is dead, but the man who killed him is very much alive, and he knows you survived Damascus." Sarah's hand stilled on the coffee machine, and for a moment the only sound in the diner was the relentless buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead. Nightshade 7. No one had called her that in 3 years. No one should have known that designation even existed. She turned slowly, her green eyes meeting Marcus's steady gaze, and saw something there that she hadn't expected. Not threat, but recognition. Not the look of a hunter, but of someone who understood what it meant to be hunted. "Your agency," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Retired," Marcus replied, "but I helped design the program that got you into this mess." Deputy Director James Crawford was running a side operation using Nightshade assets to facilitate arms deals with terrorist organizations. When you and your team got too close to the truth, he had you all killed, except he missed one. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence, confirming what Sarah had suspected but never wanted to believe. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Crawford, James Crawford, the man who'd recruited her personally, who'd promised her that she was serving her country's highest ideals, who'd looked her parents in the eye at her fake funeral and accepted their gratitude for their daughter's ultimate sacrifice. He'd been the one selling weapons to the very terrorists they'd been fighting. He'd been the one who'd signed her death warrant and those of 11 other patriots who'd trusted him with their lives. The coffee pot slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the linoleum floor and sending hot liquid across her shoes. But she barely noticed. All she could think about was the faces of her teammates, good soldiers who died believing they were heroes, when in reality they'd been murdered to protect a traitor's fortune. "He's still active?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her chest like a nuclear reaction waiting for critical mass. "The deputy director, actually," Marcus said grimly. "He got promoted after Damascus, the successful elimination of a terrorist cell, they called it, a tragic loss of American heroes in service of the greater good. He's untouchable now, protected by layers of bureaucracy and classified protocols. The only evidence of his crimes died with your team, or so he thinks." Marcus reached into his jacket slowly, producing a small flash drive. But I've been investigating Crawford for 2 years. I have financial records, communication logs, shipping manifests that prove he's been selling American weapons to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and anyone else willing to pay his price. The problem is, I can't use any of it without corroborating testimony from someone who was actually in the field, someone who can verify the intelligence you gathered before Damascus. Someone who was supposed to be dead. Sarah stared at the flash drive as if it were a loaded weapon. In many ways, it was exactly that, a weapon capable of bringing down one of the most powerful men in American intelligence. The elderly couple finished their pie and left, their footsteps echoing in the empty diner. The trucker paid his bill and headed back to his rig, leaving Sarah and Marcus alone with the buzzing lights and the weight of 3 years of buried secrets. Sarah looked at the shattered coffee pot at her feet, the pieces reflecting the harsh, fluorescent light like fragments of her shattered life. For 3 years, she'd been content to serve coffee and hide from the world, to pretend that Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell had truly died in that Damascus bombing. But looking at Marcus's face, at the determination in his eyes, she realized that some deaths are just the beginning of a different kind of life. "If I testify," she said carefully, "Crawford will have me killed within 24 hours. He has resources, connections, people who owe him favors. One waitress with a story isn't going to bring down a deputy director." But even as she said it, she could feel something awakening inside her, something that had been dormant since Damascus. The part of her that had never stopped being a soldier. Marcus nodded grimly. "That's why we're not going through official channels. Crawford has too many friends in Washington, too many people whose careers depend on keeping him clean. But he also has enemies, people he's stepped on, people who've suspected him but never had proof. Senator Patricia Hayes chairs the Senate Intelligence Committee, and she's been asking uncomfortable questions about arms trafficking in Syria. General Morrison at SOCOM has been suspicious about how many special operations assets have been burned in the Middle East. They're patriots, Sarah, but they need evidence they can act on. They need someone who was there, someone who saw Crawford's operation firsthand. He paused, studying her face in the harsh light. They need Nightshade 7 to come back from the dead. The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. 3 years of anonymity, 3 years of safety, balanced against the memory of 11 dead teammates and the knowledge that their killer was still profiting from their sacrifice. Outside, the Texas night was beginning to give way to dawn, the sky lightening from black to deep purple on the eastern horizon. In a few hours, the morning shift would arrive, and Mel's diner would fill with its usual crowd of construction workers and farmers, people living honest lives in a world where the worst secrets were gossiped about over coffee and eggs. Sarah had almost convinced herself she could be one of them, could disappear completely into the anonymity of small-town America. But looking at Marcus, at the flash drive in his hand, she knew that Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell had never really died in Damascus. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to come back to life. "What's your plan?" she asked, and Marcus smiled for the first time since he'd walked into the diner. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a hunter who'd finally found his prey's weakness and was ready to move in for the kill. "We're going to give Crawford exactly what he thinks he wants," Marcus said. "We're going to let him know that you're alive." The plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Marcus would reach out to his contacts in Washington, let it slip through carefully chosen channels that Sarah Mitchell might have survived Damascus and was hiding somewhere in the American Southwest. Crawford would have to respond. He couldn't afford to leave loose ends when it came to Operation Nightshade. He'd send assets to find her, probably a small team of contractors who could operate off the books and dispose of problems without leaving official fingerprints. But Sarah wouldn't be the helpless waitress he expected. She'd be ready, armed with 3 years of pent-up rage and the tactical skills that had kept her alive in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. When Crawford's people came for her, she'd be waiting, and Marcus would be there to document everything, the kill teams, the orders, the panic in Crawford's voice when his carefully constructed lies started falling apart. It would be enough to bring him down, enough to get justice for the 11 soldiers who died protecting a traitor's secrets. Sarah closed her eyes and made the decision that would either restore her life or end it permanently. "How long do we have?" she asked, and Marcus checked his watch. "Crawford is paranoid and efficient. Once word gets out that you might be alive, he'll have assets moving within 6 hours. We need to get you out of here and into position somewhere we can control the engagement. I know a place about 50 miles north of here, an abandoned ranch that'll give us good sight lines and multiple escape routes." Sarah nodded and untied her apron, the simple gesture feeling like shedding a skin she'd worn for too long. "I'll need weapons," she said, and Marcus's smile widened. "I was hoping you'd say that. There's a storage unit in Waco with everything we'll need. Military-grade communications, night vision, enough firepower to handle whatever Crawford sends our way." For the first time in 3 years, Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell began planning for war instead of running from it. The sun was fully up by the time they loaded Marcus's SUV with Sarah's few possessions and headed north toward their improvised battlefield. Sarah had left a note for Mel explaining that a family emergency required her immediate departure, along with enough cash to cover 2 weeks' pay. It was a small kindness in a world that had shown her precious little kindness in return. As they drove through the rolling hills of central Texas, Marcus filled in the details of Crawford's operation. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the network of corrupt officials who'd helped him funnel American weapons to terrorist organizations for nearly 5 years. The scope of the betrayal was staggering, but what made it truly monstrous was the human cost. 11 good soldiers dead, hundreds of American servicemen killed by weapons Crawford had sold to their enemies, thousands of innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of his greed. By the time they reached the abandoned ranch, Sarah's resolve had hardened into something diamond-hard and utterly unbreakable. The ranch house sat on a low hill overlooking 20 acres of scrubland, its windows boarded up and its roof sagging from years of neglect. But Marcus had chosen well. The elevation provided excellent sight lines in all directions. The old barn offered cover and concealment, and a dirt road snaking through the property gave them multiple options for movement. Sarah walked the perimeter while Marcus set up their communications equipment, her trained eyes automatically cataloging defensive positions and potential ambush sites. The soldier in her was fully awake now, her body moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent years in harm's way. This wasn't a diner in Cedar Creek anymore. This was her battlefield, and she intended to own every square inch of it. By noon, they were as ready as they could be. All that remained was to send the signal that would bring Crawford's wolves running. Marcus made the call at exactly 12:30 p.m., speaking in careful code to a contact inside the agency who owed him favors and asked few questions. The message was simple. Assets from Operation Nightshade might have survived Damascus, and there were rumors of sightings in central Texas. Within an hour, encrypted communications were flying between Washington and safe houses across the country. Crawford's reaction was swift and predictable. Deny, deflect, and eliminate. By 3 p.m., a team of 4 contractors was airborne from Virginia, their official cover story involving a security consultation for an oil company in Houston. But their real destination was a set of coordinates in central Texas, and their real mission was to ensure that the ghosts of Operation Nightshade stayed buried forever. Sarah watched them through binoculars as their black SUV turned onto the dirt road leading to the ranch, her finger resting lightly on the trigger of her M4 carbine. 3 years of hiding were about to end in bullets and blood. The contractors were professionals, moving with the practiced coordination of men who'd done this kind of work before. They approached the ranch house cautiously, 2 men covering, while the other 2 advanced, their weapons held ready but not obviously threatening. To any casual observer, they might have been security consultants checking out a remote property for their client. But Sarah could see the tells, the way they scanned for threats, the positioning that gave them overlapping fields of fire, the hand signals that spoke of military training. These weren't thugs sent to make a problem disappear. These were soldiers, probably former special forces, who'd been told they were eliminating a terrorist threat to national security. Crawford had lied to them, just as he'd lied to everyone else. The thought filled Sarah with something colder than rage. A professional detachment that allowed her to see them not as enemies, but as targets. The first man reached the front porch at exactly 4:17 p.m., and Sarah's war officially began. The engagement lasted exactly 11 minutes, but those 11 minutes contained 3 years' worth of suppressed fury and professional violence. Sarah had positioned herself in the barn's hayloft, with overlapping fields of fire covering the house and the main approach. Marcus was in the ranch house itself, armed with a sniper rifle and a clear view of the road. When the contractors breached the front door, they found empty rooms and carefully placed charges that filled the air with smoke and confusion. Sarah's first shot took out their communications, her second disabled their vehicle, and her third sent a very clear message that they were not hunting a frightened waitress hiding in Texas scrubland. They were facing Nightshade 7, and she had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. The contractors were good, but Sarah was better, and she had the advantage of knowing exactly why she was fighting while they were operating on lies and false intelligence. When the smoke cleared and the last echoes of gunfire faded across the Texas hills, 3 contractors lay dead and 1 had surrendered, his hands raised and his weapon thrown aside. Sarah approached him with her rifle trained on his center mass, her face a mask of cold professionalism that would have made her instructors at Fort Bragg proud. "Who sent you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The contractor was young, maybe 25. With the kind of desperate eyes that said he'd taken this job because he needed the money, not because he believed in the cause. "Crawford," he gasped, blood from a shoulder wound staining his tactical vest. "Or Deputy Director James Crawford. He said you were a terrorist, that you'd gone rogue in Syria and were planning attacks on American soil." Sarah felt a moment of pity for the kid. He'd been used, just as she'd been used, just as her 11 teammates had been used. The only difference was that she'd lived long enough to learn the truth. Marcus emerged from the ranch house with a laptop and a satellite phone, both of which had been recording everything that had just transpired. "Ah, we got it all," he said grimly. Crawford's voice on the communications intercepts, the kill orders, the cover story about terrorist threats, combined with the financial evidence and your testimony about what really happened in Syria, it's enough to bring him down. Sarah looked at the wounded contractor, then at the 3 bodies scattered across the ranch yard, and felt a weight she'd been carrying for 3 years finally begin to lift from her shoulders. Justice wouldn't bring back her teammates, wouldn't undo the years of hiding and fear, wouldn't erase the knowledge that her own government had tried to have her killed. But it was a beginning. It was proof that sometimes the good guys actually win, even if they have to come back from the dead to do it. The arrests began at dawn the next day, as teams of FBI agents and military police moved simultaneously against targets across the country. Deputy Director James Crawford was taken into custody at his home in McLean, Virginia, charged with treason, murder, and conspiracy to provide material support to terrorist organizations. Within hours, his network began unraveling as subordinates and co-conspirators scrambled to cut deals and minimize their exposure. Senator Hayes announced a full congressional investigation into arms trafficking and corruption within the intelligence community. General Morrison ordered a complete review of all special operations missions in the Middle East going back 5 years. And in a small cemetery in Arlington, 11 headstones bearing the names of fallen heroes finally had someone alive to tell the truth about how and why they died. Sarah Mitchell, officially still dead according to most government records, stood among those graves in the early morning light and promised her teammates that their sacrifice had not been in vain. 3 months later, Sarah testified before a closed session of the Senate Intelligence Committee, her face hidden behind a screen to protect her identity, but her voice clear and steady as she recounted the true story of Operation Nightshade. Crawford's trial would be held in secret, his sentence carried out far from public view, but the changes his exposure brought to the intelligence community would ripple outward for years to come. Sarah herself faced a choice: return to active duty with a new identity and a clean slate, or disappear once again into civilian life with the government's grateful acknowledgement that she had never officially existed. She chose a third option, accepting a position with a Senate Oversight Committee tasked with preventing future corruptions of American intelligence operations. Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell remained officially dead, but the woman who had served coffee in a Texas diner for 3 years was very much alive, and she had work to do. Some ghosts, she had learned, come back not for vengeance, but for justice, and sometimes that makes all the difference in the world.